The reason that I suspected there would be a demand was that I went to see the show in New York and went on a weeknight and saw that they had a relatively full house, and the show had been running at that point for about 3.5 months. I decided it would be worth taking the risk and giving it a shot here.
Now, you've had an unexpected response to the show so far.
Well, things are going very, very well. It's confounded a lot of the naysayers who thought that this was an ill-advised move. And I must say that I don't have a tremendous amount of experience producing theater, but I joined forces with an organization that has a tremendous amount of experience in promoting Jewish events, and it seemed to be the right move, and that's the Jewish Pocket.
Why did you jump at it? He suggested it to you.
Well, part of the answer to the question you asked, Stuart, is that the more people we spoke to about it, the more excitement we felt generated. And we found from other projects that sometimes you take an idea and you float it, and it almost seems to snowball itself. That's what began to happen here, and which gave us the encouragement to go forward with it. The Pocket, which is the production organization for cultural events and theater, is really a production group. It's made up of professionals in different areas of theater and music and the arts, other technical support type people who either are doing things professionally now in the arts or had their degrees and have gone on and done other things in their career, but still have the love of theater.
Oh, you yourself are a lawyer.
Right, I'm now a lawyer, but my background was certainly in different areas of theater and music. What we have in this group, therefore, is a lot of very dynamic energy and a commitment to large-scale quality cultural events in the city. There's so many organizations in Chicago doing many fine programs, but large-scale and very high quality is our goal. And this really set right into the pattern.
I know you were responsible for the Jewish Musical Festival here in Chicago. You said that there's been a 30-year hiatus of no Yiddish theater. What?
Not exactly no Yiddish
Chicago.
theater. As a matter of fact, there was a resurgence in the 60s that was brought back by Danny Newman and Dina Halpern, who was the dean of Yiddish actresses in Chicago. But it wasn't musical theater, and it wasn't large scale. It was more community-oriented theater.
Well, what kind of gap does this fill now?
Well, I stand at the box office when I go to the theater and take care of business, and I see every kind of person imaginable coming to the box office. There are people who are coming because they remember going to Yiddish theater as kids or as young adults, or their parents taking them. And I see younger people who are coming to take their grandparents who remember going, and everybody in between, and they're going for all different kinds of reasons.
The other side of it that's very important to emphasize is that it's a Yiddish musical, but it has narration, and it has, of course, a universality of its own in terms of the theme and the style.
It's an English narration.
Right.
So that everybody can understand it, even if you don't understand the Yiddish.
But we've said to people, interestingly enough, you go to opera sometimes and hear an Italian opera or some, and you enjoy it and you feel the enthusiasm. The same enthusiasm is in this
You just
piece.
talked about the universality of the themes. What kind of themes come out, and how are those different from the American stage?
Well, you have to first realize that the function of Yiddish theater from its inception was slightly different than the theater that was playing the Broadway of its time, and that is Yiddish theater sought to preserve and remind one of one's roots and one's origins. So it tended to be perhaps slightly more melodramatic and more embracing than the dominant American theater of the time. And that was the quality of the show that really hooked me. I went to see the show in New York, and it really involves the audience. It's played very broadly, and there's less of a distance between the actors and the audience on the stage.
Can you give some examples of themes, of feelings, situations?
Well, it was said about the traditional Yiddish theater of the 20s and 30s that at any time, in any soliloquy, at any point in the play, an actor could get on stage and declaim in his highest voice, "A Jew I am and a Jew I shall remain," and immediately receive a standing ovation. And it's basically that kind of spirit, you know, that makes Yiddish theater what it is. It relates very, very basically to a sense of cultural continuity that seems to be enjoying some kind of resurgence now in the Jewish community.
Okay, you're talking about the signaling of resurgence of Yiddish theater, Yiddish culture in general. and we're drawing parallels. Do you feel that there has been a real tangible resurgence, something we can just really pinpoint?
It's an interesting question in that we have to sort of separate perhaps what the individual in the community has taken on in terms of identifying with Yiddish culture or the history of Yiddish culture and the higher levels of cultural activity. There's no question that the community classes in Yiddish and community song type activity, learning old Yiddish songs and melodies and klezmer music has all really picked up very much in the last few years. The idea of the resurgence, perhaps, of this level of theater is the end of or the continuing part of the crest of this resurgence. So I think you see it in two levels, and it's reaching really everyone. It's amazing. I think, and we were asking before the question of whether it was part of klezmer music that brought on the resurgence of identification with language and theater that was part of Yiddish culture, or whether klezmer music sort of followed along. And I think it was very much the music which anyone and everyone could identify with, and then brought up the sensitivities and interest to go further and see what is this culture all about. What are the words really saying and meaning?
I think it's also important to realize that when you have a renewed interest in something like antique Jewish music, which is what klezmer music really is, you begin to get the younger generation being in a position to relate real directly with something that's part of an older generation. And you get that cross-generational communication, which I think tends to reinforce and communicate a tremendous amount of cultural strength and integrity.
It's called the golden chain.
Yeah, exactly. Right? And I think that for a long time, a significant portion of my generation anyway had kind of lost that chain and is now in the process of finding it again. And whether or not that was a function of the times or this particular generation, who can say? But I very strongly feel that the resurgence of interest in traditional Jewish music and Yiddish theater and Yiddishkeit in general is very much a function of seeking to extend that chain.
There was a point when we were very much caught up, and still are, of course, with Israel. But I think a lot of the early energy and excitement with Israel is part of what brought Yiddish culture to a little bit of the background. I think that's accepted. And what's happening now is a meshing, because, and again, going back to some of those universal feelings in the play, while there are some very important issues that come forth in any piece of Yiddish culture, there's a sense of humor. There's a great sense of humor. And perhaps what we've lost a lot along the way is that dealing with crisis constantly in the life of Jews around the world, we've lost perhaps some of that sense of humor. And I think Yiddish culture brings it back. It gives us a chance to step back, look at the issues, deal with the problems, and yet perhaps laugh at ourselves a little bit.
Now, the two of you are talking about this resurgence. What about the people who haven't joined that rebirth, that mainstream? How are you going to convince them to see the Jewish Gypsy and other Yiddish theater?
Well, the first time around, I don't know if it'll be possible, because there are some people to whom something like this is just, it won't become accessible, and that's a shame. It's their loss, frankly, but I think what most probably will be the result is if things go well, and this comes around on a regular basis, it'll become more accessible to everybody, and they'll be more willing to take a chance and see what's involved here.
It's exposure piece by piece, and perhaps sometimes it may seem overwhelming to go to a Yiddish play, but when we go back to the Jewish Folk Festival of last June, when Dina Halpern was with us and was on stage and did probably 10-15 minutes of poems and readings in Yiddish, you had everyone listening.
Well,
even those who didn't understand. The expression, the excitement. And perhaps that little dose there would encourage some to come and see the fuller play in its expression. And it's that type of exposure.
And not only are they taking part in the audience and reading the literature, and as we were talking about before, there's, I think, about 70 courses offered nationwide, Yiddish courses. They're also performers. What do these young people, the young performers, learn by performing in the Yiddish theater?
Well, it's very interesting. My perspective on this is that a very good friend of mine, who I knew as an actor, an English actor, got his first big break on Broadway in this play in Yiddish theater, and that's one of the reasons that I'm involved. His name is Stuart, and he has a featured role in the production. And his parents both speak Yiddish, and he understood Yiddish fairly well, but was never really interested in in Yiddish culture as such, as an end in itself, until he became a member of the cast of the play. And what he finds now is he's got this whole other theatrical world, a whole new world to draw on in terms of his acting abilities and his strengths and
Imagine versatility.
And versatility, of course. But he's got all these older actors and actresses on whose experience he can now draw. And I think that's very much true for a lot of the people in the play. It's very interesting. The cast of the Jewish Gypsies is made up of several veterans of the Yiddish theater and several young people in their late teens and 20s who either learned Yiddish as a result of going to Yiddish shulas and growing up with parents who spoke Yiddish or grandparents who spoke Yiddish, or who learned it specifically to act in the play. And they have all now become a part of this chain of Yiddish theater, so that the Yiddish theater will go on to influence at least another generation of actors and actresses.
Well, what do you think accounts for its survival? It was Ben Bonus, who some people refer to as the troubadour of Yiddish theater in New York, and I know there's other theatrical projects. Yours is, I believe, by the Town Hall Musical Theater?
The Shalom Yiddish Musical Comedy Theater.
Okay, and there are still some around. He said, for 50 years they've been telling us it's dead, but we're still playing. At one time, I think between World War I and World War II, there were 20 Yiddish theaters playing to standing room only audiences every night, sometimes 2 different shows in one day. What accounts for the dwindling numbers? I think we touched upon that a bit, but what also accounts for its survival?
Well, in terms of the dwindling of Yiddish theater, I think in a certain sense that the actors and actresses and people associated with the theater were too successful for their own good. They got to the point where they became so successful within the sphere of Yiddish theater, they decided that it was worthwhile to explore the possibility of going into the English theater. And a great many Yiddish actors and actresses ended up on Broadway, ended up in Hollywood. Molly Pecan, I believe, made a good living for a number of years doing Car 54, Where Are You? And Leo Fuchs is in movies and has been in movies, and several of the stars of the Yiddish stage successfully made the crossover to mainstream entertainment business. And that, to a certain extent, I'm sure contributed to the dwindling of the vitality of Yiddish theater. The reason that it survived and the reason that it seems to be flourishing now, I don't think you could call it just nostalgia. I think there's truly a recognition of its value in terms of the Jewish community, but in terms of the theatrical community at large as well.
It survived because I would think to a large degree, one separates the culture from the language. And while the cultural levels of it perhaps dwindled because of competing economics or competing other areas of theater or music, the language survived. It may have not been learned or spoken as completely as it was in its heyday or high points of American life, but it always survived as a language. You still knew that your grandparents spoke it, or you still knew that you understood it, even though you couldn't tell the jokes. And it survived that way. And I think, therefore, it was readily accessible when people were ready to take back the cultural levels, because the spoken language was still known by so many.
It was kind of fun. It was always that cryptic language that was spoken around the house, and if you knew one word, your ears would perk. There are some people who were talking about this rebirth, and does it have any kind of appeal to non-Jews as well? Now, there's the Jewish you can understand, but would the non-Jew find any interest in Yiddish theater?
Well, I know that my friends and associates from the theatrical community at large are all tremendously excited by the prospect of Yiddish theater coming to town, because they know about Yiddish theater as it relates to the development of the Broadway musical. It was very significant in terms of the development of Broadway and of the playwrights that really made Broadway what it was in the late 20s and early 30s. There was a lot of crossing over of talent at that point, and they're very excited. They're also very excited by they see Yiddish theater in a very real sense as kind of a living fossil of theater, and a chance to really see a theater that had a tremendous impact on the formation of contemporary theater at a time when the theater in this country was beginning to acquire truly an identity of its own. so that they're very excited about
For the
it.
general theater goer, Jewish or non-Jewish, you saw it. I unfortunately didn't have that honor,
Yeah.
but my understanding is that it's fun.
It's a great show. It got rave reviews in the New York Times, in Variety,
And
and the New York Post.
It's a story that involves emotions in terms of love and a back and forth and the music and it all. And I think
It's a
that's
great show. It's
Something everyone can
anyone
relate
can
to.
enjoy it.
Is it truly contemporary playwriting though? Is it still dealing with? Is it plays based on Peretz, Shalom Aleichem, Isaac Bashevis Singer, Mendele, or is there any new material that's coming out?
well, I don't. I know that this is that the Jewish Gypsy itself is a contemporary play. It was written recently, and it remains to be seen. I think that the success of the current generation of Yiddish theater will probably inspire people to be writing specifically for Yiddish-speaking audiences.
And that would make the difference as to whether or not we're dealing with a period of nostalgia and resurgence or whether we're dealing again with a living culture.
Yeah.
I think initially everyone's going to want to see some old pieces brought back and redone, and you always will have room for that type of classical theater. But that it be written again and come that much more alive would be an exciting step, and certainly what the Jewish Gypsy represents to a large degree.
Yeah. One of the things that we've spoken about, Michael and I, is the possibility of working out some way to have a Jewish repertory theater, not necessarily to be performing strictly Yiddish theatrical productions, but possibly to have that be a regular part of a repertory season.
Been discussing that a lot around the city, and there are many facilities that have theater groups within the Jewish community, but don't necessarily do specifically Jewish themes, and more than that, aren't able to tour. And our feeling was to have a piece that could readily go into a synagogue or go into a religious school setting and do a series of one-act plays.
How possible do you think that is?
It's very possible. It's the energy and finding the right people, and we've certainly discussed it with enough entities that we think it's something coming very shortly.
As painful as it is, I'd like you to speculate a question, something we haven't discussed. What do you think the world would be, the United States would be, theater in general would be, and our religion, our culture, without Yiddish theater?
It's hard to say. I can't imagine. I know in speaking with friends who make their living in the theater, both Jews and non-Jews, the degree to which they understand and recognize the importance of Yiddish theater in all areas of in terms of playwriting, in terms of the development of theater. It's hard to say what it would have been like without it. I have no way to speculate. I really don't. It's because it seems to have played such an integral part of the development of theater.
Do you have any?
You can turn that question two ways. One is, what would it have been if we never would have had Yiddish culture and Yiddish life altogether? And on the other hand, what would life be like to American Jewry or world Jewry today if it existed but we totally lost it? And I think if we were to be in the position today where we were to totally lose contact, as if Yiddish culture had never existed, we would lose traces of some of the most important influences in terms of certainly modern-day Jewish life. We suffered tremendously in our history during the high points of Yiddish culture, and they carry some of those expressions that we should never lose.
Well, do you think a lot of this fervor and commitment is due in large part to World War II? We lost a lot of our reading audience, our viewing audience, a lot of our Yiddish-speaking people to the Holocaust. Do you think some of this is a commitment to them, to keep it alive for them?
Well, I think possibly in a roundabout kind of way, yes, but I think moreover what it recognizes is that there was a value to the Yiddish theater and to certainly to Yiddish poetry and Yiddish culture in general. There was a certain value that could not be replaced by assimilating the values, the cultural values of the lands to which the Jewish people emigrated, and could not even be replaced by the cultural values of the new state of Israel. That these were values that were inherently Yiddish, that represented the manner in which the Jewish people had come to deal with its environment over the 1,000-year development of the Yiddish language. And those are lessons that are not easily forgotten. And I think to a large extent the preservation of Yiddish culture represents an attempt by the Jewish people to maintain that that relationship with its past.
It's a statement of its impact, that it wasn't just a language of a time and period, but that there was value that will be forever lasting in terms of Jewish life. And it's a statement that in retrospect, sometimes we can only see the value of things down the line. And I think what we're seeing is a statement that down the line we recognize that what was said, what was taught, what was studied in Yiddish culture is classical and something we need to hold on to.
But that's a tremendous task you have ahead of you. I know as chairman
Oh, but
of
it's
Pocket,
not that tremendous.
with the near demise of Yiddish fell into the hands of assimilation. Okay, so you have the second generation Yiddish-speaking Jews who want to assimilate. They knew the best way to make a buck was to speak English, to be accepted, to become American. Now there's this new generation of third American Jews who come from somewhat assimilated backgrounds. Not all. It's a terrible generalization, but true in certain parts. So how do you get beyond that? How do you get past that assimilation?
We get them out to see the Jewish Gypsy at Center East, February 28th through March 4th. In a very real sense, I think that giving people the opportunity to participate in living Yiddish culture, once given that opportunity and once they avail themselves of it, this intense metaphysical task we're talking about becomes much, much simpler because it's truly enjoyable. It's a lot of fun.
Well, you were saying you got involved in it not for religious reasons. You were even trying to think for culture. What has happened to you since you've become so entrenched in it?
Well, I've become good friends with lots of little old Jewish ladies. Well, I've become very much aware of the subculture of Yiddishists in Chicago, all of whom I find fascinating, and I count as my friends now. I'm having the time of my life putting this on. I really am. It's fascinating to generate the kind of response I'm generating in a lot of these people. I mean, the fact that this is something that is clearly in such demand is wonderful to me.
I guess what I'm getting at, do you feel that there's something in you that has been wrapped up in your heart and your soul that never was manifest before, and this is kind of helped bring it out?
I kind of always knew it was there, and I always knew that something would happen with it somewhere along the line. It's kind of interesting that it all turned out this way. I'm glad it did.
Well, so much is said about Yiddish that it can only be said in Yiddish. How many sermons have we heard, and the rabbi says a statement in Yiddish? I always sit there dumbfounded because I don't understand it. But
especially because he'll be speaking for 20 minutes and then wrap it up in 3 Yiddish words.
That's right, and that's the crux of the sermon. Can Yiddish theater successfully be translated? If the Jewish Gypsy was translated into Chinese or Russian or French, would it still be the same Jewish Gypsy?
No, I don't think so. I think in a very real sense, the experience of Yiddish theater relates in a very special way to people who are a product of that Yiddish experience. What I mean specifically are Jews of Eastern European heritage or who have grown up around Jews of Eastern European heritage. And I think it's very special in that sense. I think all cultures probably can relate in one way or another in a manner that's similar, but I think Yiddish theater is very much in a class by itself. It is very much just Yiddish theater.
And if you
Well, I was actually going back to an earlier point, and just in reference to the whole cultural move and thrust and how we get people interested and involved in this. There seems to be a whole movement in general to a reawakening of greater cultural expression in the Jewish community. That's why I think the Jewish Film Festival was so successful. That's why the Jewish Folk Arts Festival was so successful. And this is again in that pattern. People are looking for expressions of their Jewish background and community through culture. And whether it be in whatever form of the arts, they're there and they're ready to support it. And that's the message we're learning again with the Jewish Gypsy. They're really ready to support it.
I think, you can come back to some very basic sort of metaphysical questions. What are we as are we a race, a people as Jews? And I think ultimately the answer is that we are a civilization within a civilization. And as such, it's very important to have a sense of cultural continuity. And I feel that our efforts in bringing the Jewish Gypsy to town, bringing Yiddish theater to town, very much reflect an attempt to to bring that, to make that accessible to people. And it's really resonating. People are thrilled with the opportunity to go see Yiddish theater.
Obviously, the response has been tremendous. It came from New York, New Jersey. Was it New Jersey?
It's played in New York, New Jersey, Brooklyn, Philadelphia, Miami.
And now Chicago. Unfortunately, this is the last stop. If it does very well here after March 4th, what then? What are you going to do with it?
Well, I think that the actors and actresses all want to go home and take a little vacation. But I am sure that the Shalom Yiddish Musical Theater will probably have another production next year, and we'll bring them right back.
I hope so. What is, if you can speculate again, I'm doing a lot of speculation here, the future of Yiddish theater? This is done very well. We have few groups left. We have Volksbühne, Town Hall, Ben Bonus.
I think locally it's difficult to speculate. I don't think you're going to see anything locally in Chicago on a professional level of Yiddish theater in the immediate future. I think there would be too much to anticipate right now, certainly on any large scale. But the sense of Yiddish one-act plays or repertoire or even reading-type settings, I think will continue to grow. And perhaps from that will grow more. But certainly on the East Coast, again, that's where we're getting a lot of the energy and excitement of the professional theater.
I want to thank both of you, Stuart Rosenberg and Michael Lorge. I want to repeat that it's going to be at Center East for Performing Arts. That's 7701 Lincoln Avenue in Skokie. If you are interested in tickets, call 673-6300. I'll repeat that, 673-6300. I do hope you have a chance. I hope we teased you enough to see it. It's important. Thank you so much for being with us. And for Focus, I'm Deborah Palmer.
Shalom.